Hello, everybody. Welcome to both our online guests, participants, and in-person participants. Would like to welcome you to the third annual celebration of Black History Month at the McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies. For us at McCormack, it's an auspicious occasion because we get to celebrate the important history of Black people in this nation. To start this event, I would like to welcome the Dean of McCormack, Dean Adozian. Can we put our hands together for her? Thank you.
Thank you, Adana, and really sorry to the online audience about the technical difficulties that we were having here in person. So good afternoon and welcome and happy Black History Month. Thank you, Adana, who is the new president of the Pan-African Graduate Students Association here at the McCormack School. Thank you, Adana. So happy Black History Month to everyone. The Africa Scholars Forum is hosting the event, and we are celebrating our 5th annual Black History Month speaker event. We launched the series as an act of restorative justice. We wanted to remind everyone that Black history starts in Africa. We also wanted to remind people that Black history is universal and global and extends to issues concerning Africa today, to include the critical issues of African history and African affairs in our purview of Black history representation is the reason why we are bringing you today's important speaker event. I'd like to introduce the talk's speaker shortly, but I'd like to comment on how critical the speaker's topic on the impact of Kofi Annan, the first Black African Secretary General of the United Nations, his work on world history. And so Abiodun Williams is a Tufts University professor of practice, and he couldn't be a better griot to tell this story about the great Kofi Annan. Dr. Abiodun Williams is a professor of practice of international relations and politics at the Fletcher School and the Tisch School of Civic Life at Tufts University. He was also the director of the Institute for Global Leadership at Tufts University from 2017 to 2022. He was president of the Hague Institute of Global Justice from 2013 to 2016. And from 2008 to 2012, he served as the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, DC, as the first vice president of the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, and later as the senior vice president for the Center for Conflict Management, leading USIP's work on major conflict zones such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. Let me stop a little bit. Sorry to be interrupted. We're still having technical difficulties, but to speak to Abiodun Williams' bio here, from 2001 to 2007, Dr. Williams was Director of Strategic Planning for the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and for Ban Ki-moon. He gained valuable field operational experience serving with the UN from 1994 to 2000 in peacekeeping operations in the Balkans and in Haiti, in senior political and humanitarian roles. He served as an associate dean of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, DC, and he held faculty appointments at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in the University of Rochester. Dr. Williams has furthered his impact on international affairs and education through service on several boards. He served as chair of the Academic Council on the United Nations System and as a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda, Council on Justice, and the US Netherlands Fulbright Commission, and the group of senior experts of the UN's Human Rights Upfront Initiative and the Lester Person UWC College Board of Trustees. He is the recipient of several awards, including the Dr. G. Nair Global Citizenship Award from the Tufts University and the Constantine Maguire Medal from Georgetown University. He has published 4 books, including the UN Secretary General and the Security Council, and Preventing War, Romand and Littlefield, 2000, as well as several articles on conflict prevention and management. Dr. Williams holds an MA in English language and literature from the University of Edinburgh and a PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Kofi Williams. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Inidozi, for that kind introduction and for inviting me to give a lecture in the context of the Africa Scholars Forum here at UMass Boston. I'm pleased and honored to be here. I want to talk today about Kofi Annan and global leadership. As this audience knows, those of you who are here in person and those who are joining us virtually, he was the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, serving 2 terms from 1997 to 2006. I'm particularly pleased to do so because, as you heard in the introduction, I was privileged to serve as Kofi Annan's Director of Strategic Planning for 5.5 years. The fundamental challenge of creating a more peaceful and just world can often seem an abstract one. It is, of course, one that is a common endeavor. But although the mission is a shared one, there is no substitute for leadership. Leadership speaks to a human sensibility. Though we recognize our common goals, we require our mission to take form in the conviction of a leader we trust. Kofi Annan was a leader of convictions who built relationships based on trust between people of different cultures and ideologies. Kofi Annan also broke barriers. He was the first Black African and the first career UN official to lead the organization. If someone had suggested in 1945, when the United Nations was founded in San Francisco, that an international civil servant from sub-Saharan Africa would one day hold the top job, this would have been considered fanciful. Of the original 51 members of the UN, only 4 were from the African continent: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. And the first law of the UN Secretariat was that no staff member could aspire to be Secretary General. However, after more than 3 decades of climbing the UN's greasy pole, Annan had made it to the top. Kofi Annan was born in Kumasi, Ghana on the 8th of April, 1938. In 1962, he joined the UN system as an administrative and budget officer with the World Health Organization at the P1 level, the lowest professional grade within the international civil service. With the exception of returning to Ghana for 2 years from 1974 to 1976, as the managing director of Ghana's Tourist Development Board, he devoted his career to the UN system, serving in places as diverse as Addis Ababa, Cairo, Geneva, Ismailia, New York, and in branches as different as WHO, the Economic Commission for Africa, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Department of Administration and Management. Starting in 1987, Annan held a series of senior posts at UN headquarters dealing with human resources, budget, finance, and staff security. And before being elected Secretary General, he was Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations from 1993 to 1996. It is important to situate Annan's vision of the Secretary Generalship in the context of his views about states and the 20th century project of international organization. He believed that the state was still the basic and enduring entity in international relations and the main holder of political authority in the world. States had a responsibility to maintain international order, which was necessary to protect people against the chaos of conflict. But states had a collective responsibility to promote human dignity, equity, and justice at the global level. In the contemporary world, states could not confront global challenges alone and needed the help of a broad range of non-state actors, such as businesses, philanthropic foundations, universities, think tanks, and creative individuals. Annan's conception of the project of international organization had three elements. First, international organization was a construct of reason, engaged in a permanent struggle against the forces of unreason. The 20th century provided many tragic episodes of unreason, from the Second World War and the Holocaust to the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia. At the same time, an international edifice of reason had been built through institutions to help humanity cope with pressing global problems. Second, international organization was an experiment in human cooperation on a planetary scale. International institutions must correct their mistakes, build cumulatively on their achievements, and embrace the imperative of inventiveness. And third, international organization speaks a universal language and seeks universal truths. These truths include human dignity, equality, a yearning for peace, and the awareness that people are stewards of the earth, and the understanding that despite particularisms, people are united as a human community. Even though the United Nations is an organization of states, Annan stressed that it was founded in the name of we the peoples. Indeed, the preamble of the Charter begins with the phrase, we the peoples of the United Nations. Therefore, Annan was convinced of the importance of placing people's rights and needs at the center of the UN's action. Annan saw the UN's cardinal purposes, security, development, and human rights, as interconnected and inseparable. He wrote in his landmark 2005 report, In Larger Freedom, we will not enjoy development without security. We will not enjoy security without development, and we will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. The phrase in larger freedom, also from the preamble of the Charter, summed up Annan's view that development, security, and human rights go hand in hand, and that progress in one area is meaningless without simultaneous progress in the others. As Annan also said in the report, even if he can vote to choose his rulers, a young man with AIDS who cannot read or write and lives on the brink of starvation is not truly free, Equally, if she earns enough to live, a woman who lives in the shadow of daily violence and has no say in how her country is run is not truly free. Annan regarded the new millennium, which happens once every 1,000 years, as a moment of symbolic significance, providing a unique opportunity for the world's leaders to take stock of the global situation, assess the UN's role, and set goals for the future. He persuaded the General Assembly to mark the year 2000 with a summit, the Millennium Summit in New York. In the run-up to the summit, he issued a seminal report entitled, "We the Peoples, the Role of the United Nations in the 21st Century," which contained recommendations for world leaders. The title, "We the Peoples," reflected his view that while the United Nations is an organization of states, it must serve the needs of peoples everywhere. Annan's report laid out an action plan in 4 sections: freedom from want on combating extreme poverty, freedom from fear on addressing deadly conflict, sustaining our future on tackling climate change and promoting environmental sustainability, and renewing the United Nations, which called for a stronger and more people-oriented UN. The report also included what were to become the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, a set of 8 specific targets for the world to achieve by 2015, including halving the proportion of people living in extreme poverty, achieving universal primary education, and halting the spread of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. In particular, Annan felt he had a duty to engage in the international effort against HIV/AIDS. He was acutely aware that HIV/AIDS was ravaging many countries in Africa and taking away not only the continent's present, but also its future. By 1999, the largest number of AIDS patients lived in sub-Saharan Africa, and 5,500 Africans were dying of the disease every day. Annan's global advocacy had 4 goals. First, to help combat discrimination, prejudice, and violations of human rights faced by people with HIV/AIDS. Second, to help mobilize action and resources to combat the epidemic. Third, to help make therapies and medicines more affordable and accessible for people in developing countries. And finally, to support efforts to develop an effective vaccine. In 2001, Annan brought together the heads of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies and persuaded them to make antiretroviral drugs available in poor countries at affordable prices. At the African Summit in Abuja in April 2001, Annan called for a war chest to wage an effective global campaign against AIDS. This led to the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. He donated his $100,000 Philadelphia Liberty Medal Prize to the Global Fund to motivate and inspire other donors. Many thousands of people would not be alive today without Annan's leadership on this issue. Through bold and sustained leadership, Annan elevated HIV/AIDS on the global agenda. He articulated a vision, mobilized resources, and forged a global consensus to combat the epidemic. At a time when denial of HIV/AIDS was prevalent, he urged world leaders to counter the silence and shame that hindered their response to the disease. He recognized that the solution to the HIV/AIDS crisis could not be left to governments alone, and required multilateral collaboration involving the active participation of international and regional organizations, businesses, and civil society. Annan recognized the growing global importance of migration and provided the inspiration for the creation of the Global Commission on International Migration. He persuaded skeptical member states that the United Nations was an appropriate forum in which to discuss and find a collective approach to this sensitive issue. At his urging, the General Assembly held its first high-level dialogue on international migration and development in September 2006, and a large majority of the Assembly endorsed his proposal for the creation of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Annan was active in the field of conflict prevention. He worked tirelessly to elevate conflict prevention on the global agenda through his speeches, statements, reports to the General Assembly and the Security Council, as well as by his diplomatic initiatives. He sought to move the United Nations from a culture of reaction to a culture of prevention, and articulated what this should and can mean in practice. In his first year in office, he produced a report on the causes of conflict in Africa for the Security Council. He identified 4 broad interrelated causes of conflict in Africa: historical legacies, internal political factors, external factors, and economic motives. When presenting the report to the Security Council in April 1998, Annan said, "For too long, conflict in Africa has been seen as inevitable or intractable or both. It is neither. Conflict in Africa, as everywhere, is caused by human action and can be ended by human action." Annan played a critical role as a mediator in the Bakassi Peninsula border dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon. His patient and careful diplomacy over several years helped to prevent an interstate war over that disputed territory. Annan's mediation suggests that focusing not only on the headline-grabbing disputes is an important component of global leadership. By the late 1990s, it was evident that preventing the recurrence of conflict, post-conflict peacebuilding, was an urgent imperative. Annan was convinced that more effective mechanisms were needed to prevent the recurrence of conflict after civil wars and to ensure that longer-term efforts towards development were not undermined by renewal of conflict. At his recommendation, world leaders decided at the 2005 World Summit to create the United Nations Peacebuilding Architecture, comprising the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Fund, and the Peacebuilding Support Office, so that the UN system can better meet the challenge of helping countries successfully complete the transition from war to sustainable peace. In contrast to his predecessors, Kofi Annan sought to provide global leadership on human rights. Human rights are one of the most controversial issues in international diplomacy. Nonetheless, Annan believed that the cause of human rights lies at the very heart of the UN's mission. The promotion and protection of universal human rights was also an important way to advance human dignity. While propitious geopolitical circumstances, notably the end of superpower rivalry, created the context for his efforts, Annan's upbringing and moral values impelled him to seize the opportunity. Annan observed that his education was infused with a moral purpose, and he was taught in the spirit of faith that suffering anywhere concerns people everywhere. Speaking at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, Annan said his moral education and political development was also greatly influenced by the struggle against apartheid and racial injustice in South Africa. The dismantling of South Africa's apartheid system was on the UN's agenda from the first session of the General Assembly in 1946. And when Nelson Mandela addressed the General Assembly for the first time as President of South Africa, he said that the historic change in his country had come about not least because of the great efforts in which the UN engaged to ensure the suppression of the apartheid crime against humanity. Annan rejected the view that human rights were not universal, nor of concern to poor nations. He maintained that human rights are universal because their roots are in all cultures and traditions. While he was convinced that human rights are important as intrinsic values, he also believed that they are vital for achieving other crucial goals, such as the prevention of conflicts and alleviation of poverty. The creation of the Human Rights Council in 2006, which replaced the Commission on Human Rights, was Kofi Annan's main institutional achievement on human rights. Annan's support for human rights delivered a tremendous boost to the global human rights movement. In the contentious field of human rights, he was willing to question shibboleths, especially the idea that sovereignty was absolute. As a human rights advocate, he tried to make what had long been accepted unacceptable. Annan was keenly aware of the UN's failure to prevent genocide in Rwanda in 1994 and at Srebrenica in Bosnia in 1995. Both tragedies were largely imputable to the unwillingness of the Security Council and troop contributing countries to take timely and decisive action, but had happened on his watch as head of UN peacekeeping. Consequently, as Secretary General, he demonstrated a strong commitment to protecting populations threatened by genocide and mass atrocities. At the request of the General Assembly, he produced a frank report on the Srebrenica massacre and accepted the findings of an independent commission on the Rwanda genocide, which he himself had set up. The first recommendation of the independent inquiry into the UN's role in the Rwandan genocide was that Annan should initiate an action plan to prevent genocide involving the whole UN system. Annan launched the action plan in Geneva on the 7th of April 2004, the 10th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. The General Assembly had designated the 7th of April as the International Day of Reflection on the Rwandan genocide, and Annan decided that this would be the appropriate day for him to unveil his action plan. Annan grappled with the contentious issue of humanitarian intervention and articulated two notions of sovereignty, one for states, one for individuals. He believed that sovereignty implied responsibilities as well as powers, and that the purpose of state sovereignty is to protect citizens, and therefore it cannot be accepted as a pretext for denying them protection. Annan was a quintessential norm entrepreneur when he urged member states to resolve the tension between the principle of sovereignty and the international community's responsibility to respond to massive human rights violations. The Canadian-sponsored International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty developed the concept of the responsibility to protect in 2001, and at the 2005 World Summit, all member states unanimously accepted the R2P principle to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The responsibility to protect was a significant normative development which reflected the Annan doctrine that state sovereignty cannot be used as an excuse to shield atrocity crimes. Kofi Annan described the responsibility to protect as one of his most precious of all achievements. Let me say a word about Kofi Annan and the Bully pulpit. The international political environment during the Cold War constrained the public role and pronouncements of Annan's predecessors. When Annan was appointed Secretary General, the Cold War had ended, providing him a greater political space and opportunity for a public role. In 1999, he said, "For Americans, the presidency has been seen as a bully pulpit. At least since the days of Theodore Roosevelt, I have sought to make the office of Secretary General a pulpit too." He believed that the Secretary General had unique moral authority to present global values and must speak out in defense of human rights, the victims of aggression or abuse, and the poor and the marginalized. He used the Secretary General's bully pulpit to enunciate general principles, to speak out on specific crises, and to engage in public diplomacy on global issues. Annan used the Bully pulpit to exhort, to challenge, to inspire, and to persuade. He also used it to influence the global conversation on issues from poverty to violent extremism and to shape policy and norms. In short, he exercised soft power from a global platform. In furthering the purposes and principles of the UN, Annan did not rely exclusively on state power and interstate cooperation. He built networks with non-state actors, including civil society organizations, the academic community, think tanks, Nobel laureates like himself, celebrities, and in the starkest departure from previous sectors general, the private sector. Civil society organizations and the private sector, through initiatives such as the Global Compact, have become involved in the UN's activities to a degree that was unimaginable 2 decades ago. So in conclusion, let me say that Kofi Annan combined a realistic humility about the UN's purposes with bold and visionary leadership, thereby maximizing the organization's potential where it had a special role to play. His tenure as Secretary General should remind us that realism about the UN's deficiencies does not entail fatalism about the opportunities it presents. The first Secretary General in the 21st century, Kofi Annan encouraged the world to forge a collective response to the many global challenges of the new millennium. In a period of rising nationalism and xenophobia, he affirmed that global institutions and universal norms are not threats to particular identities or interests. He was an internationalist icon. On Kofi Annan's death in 2018, his successor, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, said, "Kofi straddled many worlds, north and south, east and west, but he found his surest anchor in his African roots and identity." South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu described him as an outstanding human being who represented our continent and the world with enormous graciousness, integrity, and distinction. The peacemaker is blessed by scripture, but too often we underestimate the agency that individuals can exert to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. Kofi Annan reminded us that in the cause of peace and justice, even where complex and uncertain processes are at work, the vision, competence, and empathy of an inspirational individual can make an enormous difference. Kofi Annan's core ideas and leadership remain highly relevant in today's international context. He has left an important legacy for our times and for future generations, and it was a privilege and honor to serve him. Thank you. Questions? Sure. And we'll take online as well.
Yeah, we also take questions and answers. We'll start from here.
Start and get people to think about their questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. It's wonderful, remembrance really of the great General Kofi Annan. Thank you for reminding us of his greatness, really, as General of the UN. So I just want to speak to two sort of compliments, around Secretary General that you sort of brushed against, but if you could elaborate on your perspectives in these two questions I have. One is Kofi Annan, got a lot of criticism, for what people consider his failures in stopping the war in Rwanda, and not being able to. He wasn't the Secretary General then, but people felt that he could have done more to send troops to Rwanda
instead, he, withdrew troops from Rwanda. And so he, books I've read about him, I've seen that clearly not go away. So could you speak to that? The other controversy is sort of opposite, where he is actually he's celebrated for his criticism of the former president of the United States, Bush, Bush's intervention into that. Kofi Annan, expressed the leadership saying that the intervention did not fulfill UN principles and guidelines. And yet the US at the time under the Bush regime thought differently and went anyway. And so there began to be a sort of conflict between the two leaders. So could you speak to that as well?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dinadozi, for the question. On the question of Rwanda, which I mentioned in my remarks, Kofi was Under-Secretary General for peacekeeping at the time of the Rwanda genocide. Of course, the primary responsibility for authorizing and deploying troops lies with the UN Security Council, and it was a colossal failure by the Security Council to take timely and decisive action to prevent the Rwanda genocide. I think what is important to remember is that all the leaders make mistakes, and even though he was not Secretary General, he was not in the Security Council, he recognized that this had happened on his watch. He apologized for it. He commissioned a hard-hitting report on the genocide. He gave access to all the cables and all the files, and he resolved to do something about it because it weighed heavily on his conscience. And one of the findings, the main finding was, of course, to come up with an action plan to prevent genocide. And he took that to heart and came up with an action plan, which he launched, as I said, on the 10th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide, which had different components and included establishing this post, which still exists, of the Special Advisor on Genocide. And I think that speaks to his leadership, recognizing how the UN and the international community had failed. It was also led to his championing of the responsibility to protect this new norm, which also provides a framework for dealing with atrocities, which was accepted by all member states at the 2005 World Summit. That would not have happened without the inspiration and the work and the energy of Kofi Annan. In terms of Iraq, it was a very difficult period for him. He recognized, I think, at the outset, that Iraq would be a tremendous challenge for the United Nations and would put the UN to new tests and to difficult tests. He tried to persuade the US administration not to go to war in Iraq, and certainly not to do it unilaterally, because of the ramifications it would have for the Iraqi people and for the region. And throughout, he tried to maintain the unity of the Security Council. He failed to persuade the US administration not to go to war in Iraq. And he said, looking back, that was his darkest period as Secretary General. And I think subsequent events in Iraq, both the loss of life of the millions and millions of Iraqis who died, US service members who also died, the destabilization of the region, Annan's concerns and his warnings have been amply vindicated. And it demonstrates the importance of using diplomacy, because war, of course, any war is a failure of diplomacy, and any war opens a Pandora's box. And it showed his leadership during that period, leading up 20 years ago, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions for our online participants? If you utilize the chat event to drop your message or your question, sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor, for our presentation. My name is Augustine. Kofi Annan's government of responsibility to protect. It's a very long African family. I think it's fair to talk about not just material achievement. We know that this but the concern is one thing that's a norm that was initially initiated to prevent mass atrocities and genocide, but those handing over a license to some superpowers or powers, what happened in Libya, and also for some of mass atrocities and of course instability and particularly in Libya at the moment. So perhaps you have to say about the abuse of that particular very norm in the contemporary international peace and
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Augustine, for that very important question on the responsibility to protect. I think part of the problem with the Libyan intervention is that because it was the authorization which had been provided by the Security Council was stretched beyond what had been agreed in the Council, at least the understanding of what had been agreed. So it created, as you were suggesting, a backlash against the responsibility to protect. I think the important thing to remember about IOTP is that the emphasis is not, it's on getting regimes to change their behavior and not about changing regimes. Of course, there are certain times when it's inevitable if you're going to have progress in terms of human rights and progress in terms of preventing atrocities. There are certain times when regimes might have to go. But the important point is that it's about getting regimes to change their behavior and not about changing regimes. And what has also happened, I think, because of Libya, in the public mind and amongst analysts, it is sometimes the responsibility to protect is sometimes equated completely with military action. And the emphasis on the responsibility to protect is on prevention. And the critical aspect is prevention. And if prevention fails, then as the last resort, then military force might be needed. But even after military force has been used, it is important to remember that there's a responsibility to rebuild societies. So an emphasis is on prevention. If prevention fails and you take force, after you've used force, the international community has a responsibility to rebuild.
We have questions by Hi, my name is Becky. I'm in and I was like to say I love your lecture and I really on the lecture that about international organizations and so do you think what is happening in the and also you can think that it's before they like they can have and also, you can see and should be doing very part of the
Thank you. It's rather a number of questions. They're important questions. Of course, take the last one first. Of course, if force is going to be used, that responsibility lies with the Security Council. There is a prohibition on the use of force in the UN Charter, except in 2 instances, where member states have the right under Article 51 to exercise the right of self-defense, and then force, which is authorized under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Those are 2 instances in which force can be used under the Charter. I think the second question you also mentioned had to relate to identities. I think Annan recognized that human beings have overlapping identities. Racial identity is one identity, but if individuals assert or others assert that there's only one aspect of your identity, only one identity which matters and which trumps everything else, you're already beginning to put human beings on the road to conflicts. The idea is that we have overlapping identities. And in terms of universal truths, which was your third question, I think that was the underpinning of his view on human rights, that there are certain fundamental human rights which are universal, irrespective of culture, irrespective of traditions, and those have to be respected, they have to be preserved, they have to be defended, and they cannot be abrogated by governments, by states.
Thank you so much. The meeting is very strong. I am, but in a number of the issues in the one of the commission of sovereignty for while I can speak back to for states sovereignty and one, the union and other elements. And those the meaning to be thinking back to that the African leader and
Yes, well, thank you very much. It's James, is it? James, thank you for that question. I think as I said, one of Kofi Annan's great contributions, intellectual, which also has practical significance, is this notion of 2 sovereignties. That yes, states have a right to sovereignty. It is recognized in the UN Charter itself, but also you have to recognize the sovereignty of peoples, and the sovereignty of peoples that underlines his concept of human rights, that states do not have the right to trample on the sovereignty of peoples, that governments derive their authority from peoples. And he saw a link also between democracy and human rights, that democracy was important in guaranteeing human rights and freedoms, not a perfect system, lots of flaws, but that human beings should be free to speak openly and to decide the governments which which should rule in their societies. So this was something he felt really, really passionately about, and he spoke up wherever he saw violations of sovereignty, of sovereignty of the peoples.
Hello, my name is Elias. I'm a graduate student here in the conflict resolution department. My question kind of is the flip side of the question that the ability about Secretary General having been always put in defense on the issue of Rwanda, and yes, you say that it's coming up over and over, and you know, to understand it's to the report that is fitting and also quite excited about what went wrong, how quickly that can happen again. Mine is going to look more into focus on having been the past typically generally. I know we have got Northern Africa and all of them, they are on focusing in terms of global affairs. And so I think of course the past African focus on and there's such long issues. United Nations always seems to be more relevant than from the original Kenyan. When you're in Africa, you see the presence more in United Nations with peacekeepers, development, all of that. And so for Africans, I think it still plays a very central role in a lot of the challenges today, conflict, political issues, economic issues and side, UNAIDS and all of that. To what extent can we say that a non-state as the side of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, might have moved African issues to the center of the United Nations Liberation Commission? We also know that African issues are always kind of in the periphery, they are always afterthoughts. But to what extent, Rwanda aside, we stated by the time here, and we say that he put the continent and its issues at the core of the United Nations again.
Thank you very much for that important question, Elias.
Yes.
Thank you. As Secretary General, Annan was very conscious, of course, of his African heritage and conscious and concerned about issues pertaining to Africa. So, for example, if we think about peace and security and conflict prevention, that seminal report which he did about the causes of conflict in Africa had a tremendous impact in terms of garnering support within the UN system amongst donors to focus on African issues. I think, as you know, most peacekeeping operations are deployed in Africa, certainly. And so when he established the Brahimi report at the turn of the century to look at ways to strengthen peacekeeping, it was to make sure that peacekeeping, both in the composition and the work of peacekeepers, would be strengthened, knowing that most of the operations are, of course, in Africa. This tool for the prevention and the management of conflict should be enhanced, which would be to the betterment of peoples dealing with conflict, and certainly peoples in areas where peacekeepers are deployed. I think in terms of development, his emphasis on the Millennium Development Goals and putting the issues of development front and center was key. And then also, as I mentioned, the whole issue of HIV/AIDS and UNAIDS, and putting HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, all of those issues at the center of UN action. So I think and of course, also in peace and security, the whole UN peace building architecture, the Peace Building Commission, and countries on the docket of the Peace Building Commission. Some of those are African countries supported by the Peace Building Fund and the Peace Building Support Office. So in peace and security, in development, in human rights, he emphasized all of the issues which were important to Africa, and of course, the rest of the world.
I would like to ask a question. In the light of celebration of Black History Month, was it possible that do you think Kofi Annan could have done a better job of putting or I wouldn't say a better job, right? The P5 in the United Nations consists of just 5 superpowers, right? I'm thinking Kofi Annan could have used vantage position as a Secretary General speaker. Put Africa at a vantage point in the United Nations, or do you think Africa is supposed to be kind of what are the criteria that somebody in have? Because I think we agree that they are imbalance and we have the vulnerable. You know, they have the power to decide what happens in Africa. Why can't our voices be heard at the state level in Africa in the common part? Why would we have a representative? You can say something like, when the United Nations began, it would have been really fancy for people to think that an African sub-Saharan region would have been, in general. But at the point where it became institutional, couldn't we have used a position to make Africa for obscurity to, a position at a table where decisions would be taken?
Oh, he did. He did. He advocated, I mean, the Security Council, of course, reflects the realities of political and economic power of 1945 and does not reflect the world of 2023. Annan was conscious of this. And in fact, in his last wave of reforms in 2005, in the report In Larger Freedom, he put two proposals before the member states to enlarge the Security Council, which would actually reflect the political and economic realities of the 21st century. And he argued for reform of the Security Council because he felt there was an issue of representativeness. You had an issue of legitimacy, that you could not have a council and should not have a council, which does not reflect the world of today. But unfortunately, the member states could not decide and still cannot decide on expanding the Security Council. He could not, as Secretary General, expand the Security Council or include member states on his own. What he could do was to use the bully pulpit, which he did on several occasions, to come to argue why this was necessary and vital for the UN, and also to put before the member states clear and concrete proposals. And it was left to the member states to decide, but they did not. So you see, a Secretary General can propose, but it is the member states who dispose.
So do you think that the general power quite performs against what we try to do?
I wouldn't say so. I hope, as you've seen from my lecture, you've seen that even though the Secretary General is not a head of state and is not a head of government, cannot levy taxes, cannot deploy troops, it does not have the powers that you would associate with a head of state and a government. But what the Secretary General does have, of course, is the responsibility under the Charter to bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter which, in his or her view, threatens international peace and security, and never explicitly invoked that. But the Secretary General is also a mediator, is a diplomat, is a non-entrepreneur, and has an unparalleled and unrivaled global platform. And he used the bully pulpit in that way. He also took concrete initiatives. I give you an example of the dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon, which could have led to an interstate conflict between Africa's most populous country and Cameroon. He was involved in that and helped to resolve that issue at the African continent. So there are not, even though there are limitations to the position of Secretary General, he used to joke that the acronym for his post, SG, as we used to call him, stands for scapegoat, rather than the Secretary General. And even though the Secretary General is often the scapegoat for member states, he used the position of the office and had a tremendous impact in very practical ways, despite the limitations.
Thank you so much for the question. That was very helpful for the answer. So I wanted to expand a little bit about if we could do more to whether or not we identify a structural condition of the UN that may have, I guess, limited the extent of Kofi Annan's sacrifice for Africa.
Yeah. Well, that's a very, it's an excellent question. I think there are certain limitations, I think, as I was suggesting in my last answer, because the Secretary General is not a head of state. The Secretary General is not a head of government. So that, of course, and does not have the powers that you have of a head of state and a head of government. So there are certain inherent limitations in the position. The UN is an organization of sovereign states and sovereign governments, as it dramatized when you see the flags in front of the UN complex. So it is an organization of states. And that, of course, is a limitation on a Secretary General, because you have to find a way to persuade the member states. And then even amongst the member states, you have different blocks, different regional blocks, and different constellations. And the Secretary General has to find a way to work with the member states. So that is always a huge challenge as well. You also, of course, a constraint for Secretary General, any Secretary General, is the nature of the international system at the time. So the nature of geopolitics at the time for Secretary General, the economic situation at the time. One difficulty, of course, for Annan, of course, he was Secretary General during 9/11. And when we had the attack in New York, the Twin Towers, the attack in Washington, and there was a moment, of course, of great international harmony, as most countries supported the United States, but that quickly dissipated with the Iraq war, as Edozie was asked in her question, and that cast a shadow on the UN, and there were lots of intemperate and bitter debates over Iraq, which cast a shadow on the UN and made it very difficult for the Secretary General to operate.
Some part of my question has already been answered, but beyond the listing of the things that the Annan was able to achieve, to look beyond the veil of that to how this man from Africa is able to hold his own in the middle. Still is a very large city. And was a time in which the three wars in Africa were leading, the development wars, the secession wars in the countries, and of course the health wars, the HIV and the wars as well. And these are very difficult, very difficult to be a Black man who suddenly was advocating for his own after time. But they were talking about development, talking about how to remain consistent in what principles.
Thank you very much for an important question. I think it came from core values that he had and core convictions that he had. It was also a part of his upbringing, because, as I said, he mentioned coming from a family and a tradition of compromise and conciliation. It came, of course, from his education, which he said infused him with a moral purpose. It also, he had a personality which was able to smooth differences and to identify the common interest and to build upon those interests. And I think above all, international trust is the oil which lubricates international relationships. It is intensely personal. It takes time to develop. And Annan was able always to develop and build relationships of trust with people from a whole range of different races and backgrounds and nationalities. And that trust enabled him to be a visionary leader that he was. I think.
That's the word I think I was.
Prominently have is from Vivek Ayemo, who is the controller of the Global Governance and Human Policy Program. So he said, I don't have a question. I would just like to say that Kofi Annan was and continues to be an inspiration for me. He inspired me to pursue my student career path while he is no longer with us. His legacy lives on. Comment from Vivek Ayemo. Thank you.
Yes, of course, I think one of the challenges we're facing at the international community at the moment, we have a whole range of problems facing the world. And there's clearly a dearth of leadership in terms of leadership which is principled, which is visionary, in the way that Annan was. But I do think that he had immense faith in young people. And he always used to say that you're not too old to learn and you're not too young to lead. And I think he would see the future in you and the young people and have great faith in what you will do in your careers in international affairs and be the sorts of change makers and agents of change that he was. And he had that undying faith in young people all over the world, and certainly young people in Africa and people of African descent. But his faith in young people was undiminished. Thank you.
It's a really inspiring and interesting talk, and a really reflective one for us. And I hope we took one or two things from this talk. And we would also like to tell you that we are inspired as Dr. candidates to do better. And it's a big shoe to fit in, but we'll make our back.
Thank you.
I would like to call on you to give a.
Well, just to say thank you as well. I mean, you did a great job.
Yeah, thank you.
It's fantastic talk, and really grateful to have you grace us this Black History Month special. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Chief, that's I want to make a bigger. I give you my phone.
Thank you.
Very tired.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Have some remembrance remarks. And thank you to the online audience. Are they still there?
Yes.
Thank you so much. We would invite you to have some refreshments with us, but you're too far away. So thanks for gracing us with this occasion. And we will see you next time. We have another Black History Month special from the McCormick School next week. We're hosting Councilwoman Tanya Fernandez Anderson, Councilwoman of Boston City Council. She'll be speaking on her resolution that passed in the Boston City Council on resolving to acknowledge and apologize for the role that Boston has played in the transatlantic slave trade. So don't miss that next week. Watch out for the flyers and invitations to register. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.